السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم وأكمل التحيات على سيد السادات سيدنا ونبينا محمد خير البريات وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. الحمد لله. In our sections on Maraqi al-Falah, on the book of fasting, we are in the chapter on those fasts that require a pre-dawn intention and those that don't, right? And this, a lot of Hanafis live confused, right? About why? Because broadly there are two considerations. What are the two considerations with respect to these kinds of fasts? Tabeet and ta'yin, right? Tabeet, bayyata, yubayyitu is what? What's bayat?
To spend the night.
Yeah, is that which happens fi waqt al-baytuta, which is the night time, right? What happens at the night time? So that's why a bayt refers to a room, right? It's ma yubatu fihi. The hadith of the Prophet فإنه لا يدري أين باتت يده, right? Like, you know, about the washing hands before wudu, because you don't know where your hand went to sleep. So tabeet an-niyya is to make the intention before Fajr time enters. And the ta'yin. Now, if you diagram this, you'll have clarity. What is the asl with respect to the intention in fasting? Right? If we go back, intention, what is it? Is qasdu ta'a. Right? It's qasdu ta'a. The asl is that which is already specified does not require specification, right? That which is already specified does not require specification. But that which has multiple possibilities, multiple reasonable possibilities, does require specification. So if we just backtrack with respect to the prayer, which prayers can you pray without specifying the intention of which prayer, what kind of prayer you're doing? Just mutlaq an-niyya, just I intend to pray. Which ones can you do it? Yeah, everything besides the fard and the wajib. Right? The nafil in its most broad meaning, right? The sunnah mu'akkada, the sunnah mustahabba, the nafl mutlaq, all of them can be done with a general intention. Why? Because the nafl is, in this case, to pray, right? The nafl is to pray. So there's no need for specification there. And if you specify, you've taken the aspect. This in terms of validity. In terms of what's superior, that's a separate discussion, right? So here, but the fard prayer requires specification. Why? Because you could be intending, there's a possibility, it could be ada or qada, right? It could be doing the current prayer, it could be a previous prayer. There's multiple intention possibilities. So you need to specify that you're praying dhuhr, for example, or asr, etc. Now if you apply that to the fasting, then the nafil remains clear. The nafil fast, which is other than the fard, the fard or or the wajib fasts, the nafil is very clear. You don't need to specify the intention. Why? Because the nafil is that you're fasting for the sake of Allah. Right? If you were to compare the fasting, the obligatory fast, with the prayer, you would think that you would need to make tabeet of it. But why don't you need to make tabeet or to specify it with respect to the fard fast?
Because it's already specified?
Yeah, because it's already specified, right? In Ramadan, what else would you do? Right? What else would you do? So that's where the only issue that comes up is وَلَوْ نَوَى صَوْمًا آخَر. This is an issue that we'll see. If you intended some other fast. Right? But even if someone foolishly or deliberately intended to fast a nafil, it still counts as Ramadan. And they'll explain the legal component of that. Right? The legal component. So in a very simple way, if we look, another way of, sort of a slacker's way to learning is sometimes you have to simplify things. What are the main fasts we do? Yeah, there's 3 main types of fasts that people do. The current Ramadan fast, the nafil, and then you have qada. Those are the 3 basic types of fasts. We're not doing then there's other things that you can then put in. But sometimes you have to sort of simplify and then look for complexity. So which ones don't you need to specify? And if you don't need to specify it, you don't need to make tabeet of it, right? The 2 things go hand in hand, right? So which ones don't you need to specify?
The Ramadan fast, the Nadhr al-Mu'min.
No, forget all those things. We said just the core fasts. Like if you,
Yes.
there's only 3 core types of fasts. The current Ramadan fast, Ramadan ada'an, the nafil, and the qada. So that's it. There's 3 core types of fasts. The others are rare. At best only some people might do kafara once in their lifetime. And hopefully they won't do it again. Right? The nadhr, keep away from making nadhr, but it's relatively rare. Right? What other fasts are there? Right? And the nadhr is muayyan and ghayr muayyan, etc. But one of the ways of understanding something is to radically simplify. There's only 3 types of core fasts. The others are extra. So, which ones don't require specification?
Anything that's not qada?
Yeah. The Ramadan fast doesn't require specification, and the nafil fast does not require specification. Right? Ramadan fast, you could just intend to fast, and you could make the intention after Fajr till the midday. And likewise with the nafil. The qada needs to be specified. Why? Because it has a wasf zaid lazim. Right? What's the wasf zaid? That this fast is it's a required fast of a particular nature. So this wasf lazim does not come pre-specified. You wake up on August 3rd, 2022. May Allah grant us to live to that and well beyond, inshallah, with good intentions. So you wake up that day and say, I intend to fast. What makes that a qada? لا يتعين قضاء. It's not pre-specified as qada, so that's why one needs to specify it. And there's prayers that are like the qada. They don't come pre-specified, that they require specification. That's what distinguishes them from the nafil. And they don't come pre-specified, unlike the Ramadan fast. But as a learning tool, sometimes you have to radically simplify something. And then you put in the complexity. Because if you have a big list of things, you don't see it with so much clarity. The things that require specification are those that are like the qada fasts. Okay. So, and we've mentioned as well that the intention, they say لا يتصور عادة أن يخلو مسلم عن نية صوم رمضان أثناء رمضان إلا لعارض. Right? It's not normally conceivable that a Muslim be bereft of the intention of fasting in Ramadan during Ramadan, normally. إلا لعارض, unless they're sick or they're traveling, for example, right? Or, may Allah protect us and you, unless they're not someone who fasts daily, right? But that's an exception, right? Okay, so that's a little bit of a framework from which we operate in this chapter. And diagram this, it'll be very clear. But understand why the distinction happens. So, قال الإمام فقيه النفس أبو الإخلاص حسن بن عمار الشرنبلالي رحمه الله فصل أما القسم الذي لا يشترط فيه تعيين النية, as for the type of fast that does not require specifying the intention لما يصومه, of what you are fasting, ولا تبييتها, nor making it before dawn, أي النية فيه, of making the intention before dawn, فهو أداء رمضان, it is the current performance of Ramadan, وأداء النذر المعين زمانه, and the current performance of a vow whose time was specified, كقوله لله علي صوم يوم الخميس من هذه الجمعة. If someone made this oath that they said, it is it is literally, it is upon, for the sake of Allah, upon me that I fast the Thursday of this week. فإذا أطلق النية ليلته أو نهاره إلى ما قبل نصف النهار صح. So if one makes a general intention, أطلق النية أي عن أي وصف سوى الصيام, right? That one makes a general intention, right? Right? And this is مطلق النية أي نوى الصيام دون تعيين, right? Just intended, I'm fasting. Because it's pre-specified. يعني ليلته, during the night, which is superior, أو نهاره, or during the day, إلى ما قبل نصف النهار صح. Until the midday. What is the midday? نصف النهار?
الزوال.
No. نصف النهار is not the zawal. Yeah, ضحوة الكبرى, but that's just a synonym. When is it? Yeah. So the day begins when Fajr enters, the day ends when Maghrib enters. That's the Nahar. Now Nahar has various usages in Arabic, right? And it's something good to just be aware of. Nahar, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the Nahar as, it is a layl wa Nahar, right? So the day is divided into two conceptual halves. When the sun has risen, when the sun is up, that's Nahar. When it's down, it's Layl, basically, right? But then Nahar also is used in a relative sense as well, right? Of the first part of the day, for example, right? And that's other usages, right? And it's something good to investigate, because in the Quran, in the Hadith, you'll see these nuances of usage, and the fuqaha are using the Arabic language. So you can look into that, right? But Nisf al-Nahar is well before the Zawal. And you could check, someone could do the calculation. When does Fajr enter? When does Maghrib enter? And what would the halfway point be? It's typically over an hour before Dhuhr, sometimes more, depending on the length of the day. Right? Someone could calculate it as we're speaking right now for Toronto. So if you make the intention at night or until the midday, nisf al-nahar, it's valid. وَخَرَجَ بِهِ عَنْ عُهْدَةِ الْمَنْذُورِ. And that way you have fulfilled what is due upon you, the uhda of the manzur, of your what you have vowed. وأداء النفل, and likewise performing a nafl. فيصح كل من هذه الثلاثة, each of these three are valid, بنية معينة مبيتة من الليل, whether with a specific intention made at night, right, i.e. before Fajr time, وهو الأفضل, and that's superior, right, وهو الأفضل, وفيه الخروج من الخلاف, and that avoids the difference of opinion of the Shafi'is. And it is also closer to caution in terms of the primary text, because it has come from Al-Habib Al-A'zam sallallahu alayhi wa sallam that لا صيام أو لا صوم لمن لم يبيت. There's no fast for one who does not make their intention at night. And that's nafyul kamal, not nafyul sihha, and that's a negation of perfection, not a negation of validity, with the evidence of his own action sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, as we will see. Right? That sometimes he would go to his wives in the morning and ask, is there something to eat? They said no, said then فَإِنِّي صَائِمٌ. Then he said that I am fasting. That being the beginning of the day, and that's off the evidentiary basis for النية المتأخرة, of the late intention. Right? And then he reminds us, وَحَقِيقَةُ النِّيَّةِ, and the reality of intention, قَصْدُهُ عَازِمًا بِقَلْبِهِ صَوْمَ غَدٍ. Right? The reality of the intention is the firm resolve with the heart that you're fasting the next day. وَلَا يَخْلُو مُسْلِمٌ عَنْ هَذَا فِي لَيَالِي رَمَضَانِ. And a Muslim is not free of that. Right? Right? In the nights of Ramadan. Right? Because the niyyah is not words on the tongue, but it's a niyyah معان دون قالب اللفظ. Like you have to have the meaning in your heart, in your consciousness. It doesn't have to be in those words. فكل ما دل عادة على هذا المعنى يكفي. So anything that indicates this meaning of fasting tomorrow is sufficient. You didn't have to have, did I intend to fast and assume? You don't have to. That's why, as Tahtawi mentions, niyat al-tasahhur. I need to get up for suhoor. Someone says, why don't we let's order brisket for suhoor. And they're not thinking of fasting. غَلَبَ عَلَيْهِ. They just have this thought that there's this brisket place that delivers in time for suhoor. And I asked someone, so why are you having suhoor? He says, because I get hungry. You get hungry for what? For fasting. Because I'm fasting. Khalas. There's the intention of fasting, right? So we learn and we teach how to make a proper intention, but not in a way that we make people worried about their intention. But we don't just tell them, khalas, just flow with it, because they miss out on the fadila and ikmal, and the istihdar of the niyyah and so on, of the virtue and having presence of the intention, because that's what is ruhul amal. Okay. Right? Right? So this is, and there are many other similar texts, and if you want to gather some related texts, you can find them. Right? This is something important for people to keep in mind. Right? Okay. وَلَيْسَ النُّطْقُ بِاللِّسَانِ شَرْطًا. And uttering with the tongue is not a condition. Actually, having the framework of the words that is not needed in the heart either. That right? So then he says, but then there's immediately there's an i'tirad. Right? Now what about the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? لا صيام لمن لم يبيت. There's no fasting for one who does not make a pre-dawn intention. Right? Which is in Sunan Sunan al-Kubra for Nasa'i. And there's a number of such hadiths. It says, وَنَفْيُ الصِّيَامِ لِمَنْ لَمْ يُبَيِّتْ لِمَنْ لَمْ يُبَيِّتِ النِّيَّةِ نَفْيُ كَمَالٍ. And the negation of fasting from one who doesn't make an intention at night is a negation of perfection. One, because that is the basis of this kind of negation. La siyama. What kind of la is this, folks? We've now been seeing many examples of this throughout, right? What kind of la is this? This is la nafiya. Right? So it's a negative la. There is no fasting. La siyama. La siyam here is what is it grammatically? This ism la. What is not mentioned in the statement? La siyama liman lam yubayyit. And there are different narrations. Liman lam yubayyit, some liman lam yubayyit an-niyya, etc. What's not mentioned? The khabar of la. Right? And this is what is called taqdeer. And in the Hanafi school, at-taqdeer min bab al-darura, it's a necessity. So what necessity and the principles of necessity entail that you make the full, that necessity in general is limited to how much? The minimum necessary. Right? التقدير من باب الضرورة والضرورة تقدر بقدرها أي بالأقل. Right? When you have to specify something implicit, this is out of necessity. So the general principle of necessity in our deen and in the usage of the Arabs is that you deem the minimum necessary to be implicit, which is nafyu al-kamal lis-sihha, negation of perfection, not negation of validity. Right? And this goes back to the usage of the Arabs. And so the principles of usul, they didn't just say, okay, look, we're going to put this asl. No. This goes back to an understanding of the Arabic language and its usage. That's why nahu, sarf, balagha, all these are so important. Right? And usul al-fiqh is so important. And also, of course, to deepen it, to get back eventually to being comfortable with pre-Islamic Arabic, right? But but everything in its due time, not rushing things. So that's the usage of the Arabs. Number two, the usage of the Quran and the Sunnah itself, of that language. Right? And so this is how the Hanafis have approached the issue of our Imam Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah approached the issue of the negation in general. And you see, from one issue of understanding of language and the related principle of textual interpretation. You have all these ikhtilafat that arise. We've seen ikhtilaf related to this in tahara, in salah. We see it also here. We'll see it. We saw it about why a wali is not legally required for a woman in marriage. Right? لا نكاح إلا بولي. There's no marriage without a wali. Okay. It's not no marriage is valid. No marriage is properly complete, etc. لا نكاح كامل إلا بولي. Okay. With, of course, the proviso that doesn't mean just leave it. No. Bifadlillah, in 19 years of answering questions on it, I have not once told anyone that it's okay, that their marriage would be valid without a wali, without parental approval, because almost in every single case, it is, if people take the means, they can get approval. So, وليس النطق بلسان شرطا ونفي الصيام لمن لم يبيت النية نفي كمال. The negation of fasting from one who doesn't make the pre-dawn intention is a negation of perfection. فتصح النية ولو نهارا. So the intention is valid even if it's made during the day. إلى ما قبل نصف النهار, until what is before the midday. Right? 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 So if someone just intended, so someone was sick, so for a week they weren't fasting. They prayed Fajr, went to sleep. Of course, they didn't have anything that would break their fast. They woke up at 9 a.m. in the morning. They feel much better. I'm fasting today. They didn't think, I'm fasting Ramadan, anything. That's enough. لأن شرط وجود النية في أكثر النهار, because the condition is that the intention be found in most of the day. احتياطا, out of caution. وبه توجد في كله حكما, and by having the intention in most of the day, it is considered to be there for all the day effectively. يعني حكما للأكثر, applying the consideration of للأكثر حكم الكل, right? That للأكثر حكم الكل, right? The principle that the most of something takes the ruling of its entirety. Of course, these statements, as we mentioned, these are sort of guiding, these are packed statements. So للأكثر حكم الكل, the full statement really is قد يكون للأكثر حكم الكل في بعض الأحوال. You know, the majority of something can take the ruling of its entirety in some situations, right? So these are not things you can apply everywhere, right? They apply in some places. وخص هذا بالصوم, and this is specific to the fasting. فخرج الحج والصلاة لأنهما أركان, right? And this is specific to the fast, i.e. the lawgiver made this specific to the fast, right? Right? That you can have intention in some of it, not in all of it. Because these other actions are made up of multiple parts. لأنهما أركان, أي لأنهما مشتمل, لأنهما, because they are, meaning the prayer and the hajj are made up of multiple parts. فيشترط قرانها بالعقد على أدائها. So therefore, the intention is required when you resolve to perform them, right? And also, they're made up of constituent parts. Fasting, one of the wisdoms why you can make the intention later, because what is حقيقة الصيام? What is the essence of fasting? Imsak. And the imsak itself, because fasting is a non-action, it's not made up of parts in that sense, right? It is just one thing, imsak, which is not actually an action, it's a tark, it's a non-action. So that's already there. But prayer is made up of multiple constituent parts. So if you didn't intend it, then that standing, how is it considered to be prayer? Unless you had that intention. Because standing on its own is not salah. Right? So that's why the intention is needed with بالعقد على أدائها. عقد here بمعنى العزم. Right? العزم, النية. Right? That the intention is needed when you made the resolve to do it ابتداء in the beginning. وإلا خلا بعض الأركان عنها. Otherwise, in the prayer or the Hajj, some of the component parts of the prayer or the Hajj would be bereft of intention, so they would not count as a ibadah. فَلَمْ يَقَعْ عِبَادَةً. So therefore it would not count as worship. وَالصَّوْمُ رُكْنٌ وَاحِدٌ. As for the fast, it is one integral. أي الإمساك, refraining. وَقَدْ وُجِدَتْ فِيهِ. And it was found in it. وإنما قلنا إلى ما قبل النصف النهار إلى ما قبل نصف النهار, and it was specified as the midday تبعا للجامع الصغير. So this is following الجامع الصغير. What is الجامع الصغير?
Imam al-Suyuti's reference book.
Nope. الجامع الصغير is one of the books of ظاهر الرواية. Yep, Imam Muhammad's books. One of the most influential of the books of Zahir al-Riwayah, right? And probably the most commented upon of the books of Zahir al-Riwayah. The Hidayah, for example, the Matn al-Bidayah, added on Masail from al-Jami' al-Saghir to Quduri. Right? So the Bidayah is Quduri plus appended Masail from al-Jami' al-Saghir, and he has a certain way of constructing that. And many people wrote commentaries on Jami' al-Saghir, so much so that the ulama developed a shorthand. So some of the ulama would say قال القاضي خان في الجامع الصغير, meaning Qadi Khan said in his sharh on al-Jami' al-Saghir. Qadi Khan has a sharh on al-Jami' al-Saghir, and others. Of the very late scholars, there's a very useful book. Just make a note. It's not something you need to read right now, but one of those scholars that one can read their whole corpus of books and benefit. And there's such scholars. Amongst them, Mullah Ali al-Qari, for example, Ibn Abidin, of the later scholars. Yeah, there's people like that. Ibn Nujaym. If you read everything that these people have to write, these are very beneficial authorities. Pretty much everything they wrote. But of the more recent ones, Imam Abdul Hayy, Ibn Abdul Halim al-Laknawi is like that. Right? Of course, he has some idiosyncratic positions where he takes his own choices, but that's part of a growth process to appreciate that the ulama sometimes take their own stances, and there's a method. But he has a really useful book called النافع الكبير لمن يطالع الجامع الصغير, where he talks about the Jami' al-Saghir and its characteristics and so on. And that's a very beneficial work. And there's a lot of insights there outside of al-Jami' al-Saghir, like particularly because he's dealing with some of the attacks on the Hanafis by the literalists of his time. Bismillah. So al-Jami' al-Saghir here, because it is referring to Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan's work. Right? Imam Muhammad. And the reason he mentions that, على الأصح, according to the more sound opinion, احتراز عن ظاهر عبارة القدور. This is excluding the outward purport of the expression of al-Quduri. Right? Why? Because what does Imam al-Quduri say? Right? 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 Because he says, وَهِيَ قَوْلُهُ مَا بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَ الزَّوَالِ. Right? Because Imam al-Quduri says that it is between Fajr and the Zawal. So it would mean that if you intended before the Zawal, then it would be valid. Now, notice, and this is a point that you could actually take from the Maraqi and append to your Quduri. Why? Because he says, على ظاهر عبارة القدور, that this is what outwardly it indicates. So now there's two separate things. What does Quduri himself mean? تعيين مراد الإمام القدوري نفسه. Right? But what Imam Shurunbulali is indicating, that it could be understood على سبيل الوفاق, that between Fajr and Zawal, meaning نصف النهار. Right? وإنما قال ونصف النهار من ابتداء طلوع الفجر إلى وقت الضحوة الكبرى. إلى قبيل وقت الضحوة الكبرى. That نصف النهار is from the midday is from when Fajr enters till just before the time of what's called الضحوة الكبرى. The actual midday. لا عندهما. Right? Not at that time, لأن النهار قد يطلق على ما عند طلوع الشمس إلى غروبها لغة, because the day can refer to sunrise to sunset. وعند الزوال نصفه. Right? And at the time of zawal can be considered half of it too. فيفوت شرط صحة النية بوجودها قبيل الزوال. Right? So if you make the intention just before zawal, you've missed out on the time, right? Because in the Arabic language, the zawal is also considered the midday, insofar as that's when the sun's in the middle of the sky. So بهذا الاعتبار, it's the middle of the day. Dhuhr is the midday in one sense. And why that is, phenomenally, you can find out, right? So there are different usages for midday. And that's why there is khilaf, which you can see, we don't need to go into, right? ويصح أيضا بمطلق النية. Right? And it's also valid, يعني ويصح أيضا كل من أداء رمضان والنذر المعين والنفل, and each of these are valid also, meaning the current Ramadan fast and the specific vow, the vow of fasting a specific day, or the nafil بمطلق النية, with an unconditioned intention, just the intention of fasting. من غير تقييد بوصف للمعيارية, without specifying a particular characteristic, meaning what kind of fast are you fasting? Just you intend to fast. للمعيارية, right? Because the because because with respect to the Ramadan fast, right? Ramadan is a mi'yar, right? Is a, what fast has been legislated in it? Ramadan. So nothing else can fit there. If you intend some other fast, it counts as Ramadan, because that is the legislation. So you intend, so your intention will count. So if someone intends, I am fasting qada during Ramadan, right? The intention to fast counts. This wasf is chopped off. للتقريب, if someone intends to fast, I'm fasting, I'm praying Asr as 6 rak'ahs. The 6 rak'ahs part is lopped off, right? Because that is outside what is mashru', right? And that also has tasheehan lil amal, right? There's a number of wisdoms in it as well, but that's the mi'yar. By having specified before that you are fasting this day, the nadhr then becomes as if it's a mi'yar. You had vowed that you'll fast this Friday, with this proper form of expressing the vow. So you made that. Then what happens? You just intended to fast that day. You forgot about the vow. You didn't specify it. It counts because by your specification, you made that day as if a mi'yar, because you put a duty on yourself. Right? So it became as though a mi'yar. It sort of becomes similar to the current fast. You have specified it. So للمعيارية, this applies to the أداء Ramadan. والنذر معتبر بإيجاب الله تعالى. And the nadhr counts because Allah, right? By Allah making it binding, right? The nadhr counts by Allah making it binding by the texts related to vows, which we'll look at when we look at vows in more detail. You can look it up easily. And the nafil does not require specification to begin with, right? So he's left out some details, right? So he gives reasoning for 2 of them. The third one, the nafil, he doesn't mention because the nafil does not require specification. لعدم الاحتياج فيه إلى تخصيص, right? وبنية النفل أيضا, and it's valid with the intention of nafil. So someone wakes up in Ramadan, right? Says, I am fasting a voluntary fast tomorrow, or today. It counts as the fard because the intention to fast is considered. This extra thing is ignored. ولو كان الذي نواه مسافرا أو كان مريضا في الأصح. Even if the one who made this intention was traveling or was sick, according to the more correct opinion. من الروايتين. وهو اختيار فخر الإسلام وشمس الأئمة وجمع اختيار فخر الإسلام وشمس الأئمة وجمع اختيار جمع. Right? This is a choice of Fakhr al-Islam, and one of the things I'm going to ask you for tomorrow is who is Fakhr al-Islam and who is Shamsul A'imma. وتلغى زيادة النفلية لأنهما لما تحملا المشقة التحقا بمن لا عذر له نظرا لهما. And this extra quality that you intended, the nafil, is ignored because once they took on the burden, they're considered to be like someone who didn't have an excuse. So, out of interest for them, نظرا لهما. Why? Because otherwise there'd be a haraj for the person, right? Right? And there's this ibara of al-Karhi that الأصل تصحيح أفعال المكلفين الأصل حمل تصرفات المكلفين على وجه الصحة والسداد حيث أمكن بلا تكلف. Right? That the basis is that we interpret the actions of those morally responsible in a manner that would make them valid and sound when possible حيث أمكن من غير تكلف, without far-fetched interpretation. Right? This part of the implications of وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ. Allah has not placed any hardship for you in matters of religion. Doesn't mean like it's a free-for-all, right? بلا تكلف حيث أمكن وفق قواعد الشرع, in accordance to the principles of the Sharia, without far-fetched interpretation, right? So someone says, I'm not fasting today. So no, you are, you're just deluded. And there's some cases where someone may have waswasa, but in the general case, someone says, I'm not fasting today, means they're not fasting. Right? Okay. So there's a very useful work called, and I'd like you, books of biography are tricky, but one of the works that you should develop a familiarity with, and he gives keys to things like this. Who is Fakhrul Islam? Who is Shamsul A'imma? Is Al-Fawaid al-Bahiyya of Imam Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi. And it's a mid-sized work, sometimes published in one volume, sometimes in two mid-sized volumes. So it's, and one of the merits of it, it's quite late. Imam al-Laknawi died 1305 or 1306 Hijri. So he's not that long ago. So it has, the biographies are brief, there are more detailed works in Tarajim al-Hanafiyya, but many of them are earlier. Of the classical works, so that's something that is sort of your first reference point for Hanafi biographies. You'll find most biographies there. Its order is a little bit interesting, but it has indexes, and it's there in the Shamila as well, so you can search for things. Of course, in the Shamila, you can also search by the book as well, right? So he has a really nice thing towards the end about what's meant by the different titles in the madhab. So who is Fakhrul Islam? Who is Shamsul A'imma? That's a very good starting point. Of course, two other of the major works of Tarajim, there is a work that's brief, but it's very beneficial because of who the author is and his precision, which is Taj al-Tarajim by Allama Qasim ibn Qutlubugha. And then there's Al-Jawahir al-Mudi'a or Jawahir al-Mudiyya في تراجم الحنفية, الجواهر المضية or المضيئة. But don't complicate. Like, it's a good starting point to get familiar with it. You want to see, okay, who is Al-Isbijabi? Someone mentions, who is Al-Halwani? Is it Halwani or Hulwani? Allama Abdul Hayy does a good work, a really good job with stuff like that. And he's very picky about biographies. So, even if one intends a nafil, even if one's a traveler, because the argument, some said no, the traveler and the sick person didn't have to fast. So if they intended a nafil, it would count. If they intended something else, but, and one of the reasons the mutaakhirin, many of the later scholars, you have to at least respect, and more probably both respect and consider the choices that they made, because they're dealing with the people in their times, and their times are very often similar to our times. So there's places where they made things easier. Why? Because people are given to confusion, right? Right? Okay. And then, the awam, the common person's like the common person. God loves the common person, that's why he made so many of them. Right? As one of the American leaders said long ago. Okay? So they get confused, then they get overwhelmed, they get disappointed. La. So even if you're a traveler, or or you were sick, if you intended a nafil, another nafil in Ramadan, it would count as Ramadan. ويصح أداء رمضان بنية واجب آخر, and it's valid to intend the current fasting of Ramadan with the intention of another wajib. لمن كان صحيحا مقيما, for someone who is not sick and who is resident. لما أنه معيار فيصاب بالخطأ في الوصف كمطلق النية. So if right, so it is attained even if you made an error. يصاب أي فيصاب يعني so it is attained by making an error in the characteristic of the fast. Just like if you made a general intention. So someone intends, what's another wajib? Qada. Right? So wajib here, wajib in the more broad usage of wajib, right? بخلاف المسافر, contrary to the traveler. فإنه يقع عما نواه, because contrary to the traveler, because for the traveler it counts for what they intended. من ذلك الواجب رواية واحدة عن أبي حنيفة, because the traveler, if they intended another wajib, it would count. This is one narration from Imam Abu Hanifa. لأنه صرفه إلى ما عليه, because they directed that day to something else that was due upon them, such as qada of another day, or the nadhr غير المعين, etc. Right? So this is just for the traveler, because they weren't required to fast in general. Right? And there's reasoning for this. Right? And وقالا يقع عن رمضان, and Abu Hanifa's two students said this too counts as Ramadan. Right? Right? واختلف الترجيح في المريض إذا نوى واجبا آخر. Right? So we'll stop here. Okay, we'll just finish it. واختلف الترجيح, and then the scholars differed في صوم المريض إذا نوى واجبا آخر. The scholars differed in confirming what happens if the sick person intends another wajib. So someone is sick but resident, and they intended to make a qada بصومه في شهر رمضان. Right? So a sick person in Ramadan intended to make a qada instead of the current fast. Whatever contorted reasoning they came up with. Right? So Allah might excuse this fast because I'm sick. I want to make up one of the old ones because those have been due for so long. Right? مثلا. So they differ. And one of the reasons they differ, because there isn't a very clear, this is the riwayah from Imam Abu Hanifa is متعددة. روى الحسن, الحسن narrates, Ibn Ziyad, أنه عما نوى, that it counts for what they intended. واختاره صاحب الهداية, and this was chosen by the author of the Hidayah. وأكثر مشايخ بخارى, right? And it was chosen by most of the mashayikh of Bukhara. لعجزه المقدر. Now, of course, in a very simple breakdown of the classical Hanafi school, right? The early Hanafi school, there are two nodal points of the Hanafi school. There's Iraq, and then there's Ma Wara al-Nahar. Right? And a very simple, in terms of nodal points. ما وراء النهر, what transoxania, and of course the Hanafi school was everywhere, but the big central points, you have the big ulama of Iraq, right? Amongst them Quduri and all these people, they tended to have humble names because they were in the capital of the Khilafah and they didn't want big positions. And then you have the ulama ma wara al-nahar, and ma wara al-nahar includes big centers of learning like Bukhara and Samarkand, etc., many of which fell later after the Mongol hordes ravaged those lands. Generally, of course, now there's a revival of Islamic scholarship happening in those Central Asian lands, and they're tough people, because just look at the geography there, and you get a sense of the temperament. They're tough. And I say this fearfully because they're tough people, but generally, the precedence was given to the ulama of Iraq. That was the heartland of the madhab. Though they're great imams from those lands, of course, كما لا يخفى. So, لعجزه المقدر. And of course, it's not one of the criteria for tarjih, that what did the ulama of Iraq say? That's not one of the murajjihat. Because the person who is sick is effectively incapable, so therefore, they're like, so fasting for them is not, it's not it doesn't have the same معيارية. وقال فخر الإسلام, so فخر الإسلام والشمس الأئمة both said الصحيح أنه يقع عن رمضان. Right? So these two great scholars of the Hanafi school said that it counts as Ramadan. Now what's Imam Shurunbulali doing? Right? He's exercising caution. Right? He says that they differed about the sick person, he doesn't take a stance. We're not going to unpack this too much. Right? But just note the humility of someone like Imam Shurunbulali, who's been called a faqihun nafs. Some of his biographers said, أحسن المتأخرين. You're the best in judgment of the later scholars. المدح فيه مبالغة, but and then you find like someone who doesn't even understand what are the underlying issues, say, no, of course the stronger position is such and such. Right? And because these are دقيق issues. وفي البرهان هو الأصح. And the Burhan, the Burhan which is Sharh Mawahib al-Rahman, who is it by? Ibrahim al-Tarabulsi. He says, وهو الأصح. And it's the more correct opinion. And then he'll tell us about النذر المعين زمانه, etc. So we're going to begin with this issue of the traveler and the sick person, and if they intended something else. Now, of course, the practical thing is, someone's traveling, say, intend Ramadan. So this is not very likely, but it does happen, especially in the scenario. They say, well, I have these old make-up fasts to do, maybe I should do them before. So, right? And we'll share, just remind me, we'll share what Ibn Abdin has to say about this. You can see the summary of that in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya, right? That what happens in these two situations. Tahtawi explains a little for those who want to look at it. But there's extensive ikhtilaf on this, right? So but do diagram the general case, and you can bring this nuance in. What about the sick person? Right? So what is the case? One case is that So niyat wajib akhar. Right? There's three cases. The sahih al-muqim, the musafir, the marid. Right? So you mentioned the general case of the بمطلق النية, but in the Ramadan case, there's three sub things, which are, if you intend wajib akhar, you could be resident and well, you could be a traveler, or you could be sick. Right? So the resident person who's well, if you intend another wajib, it counts as Ramadan. The traveler, according to this, the narration from Abu Hanifa, yaqa an, according to the riwayah from the Imam and most of the scholars, if the traveler intends another wajib, then it counts as that wajib. Correct? There's ikhtilaf about the sick person. If they intended another wajib, right? Right? And they're both musahhah, right? اختلف الترجيح, they're both musahhah. Right? And there'd be an inclination towards taking the opinion, as Imam Shurunbulali in the Matan, he just says, there's ikhtilaf tasheeh. And he doesn't, and he says, وَفِي الْبُرْهَانِ, and then Burhan says, it's huwa al-asah. Right? Does he say, and I agree here? No. Right? So that you note the caution of the ulama. Sometimes people want to say, okay, what does Imam Shurunbulali say? They don't always operate like that. Right? You see that in the earliest scholars and you see it in the later scholars. Right? They use careful language. Right? Because these are majari al-anzar. These are places where the reasoning goes in different ways. Right? So they exercise caution, and that's something a talib ilm usually say, okay, what's the mu'tamad about this? Khalas. We want to collapse, for 1300 years of Hanafi scholarship into what is the mu'tamad. Right? And it's not that there isn't a mu'tamad, but sometimes it's a nuanced issue. Right? And this ikhtilaf is also rahmah. It is rahmah. Someone wants to be cautious, and there are people like that who want to be cautious. We could, and then one navigates it. Why do we know? Someone who's cautious, their sister comes, she fasts a lot. She tells, هذا في اختلاف, if you intend to make it up, ahsan. Right? So you can point them towards caution. You don't have to unpack the issue. You don't have to have a stance on everything. But because of the ikhtilaf of tasheeh, someone else might come and they're like, what would the mashayikh do? Frequently they'd ask them questions. How often do you fast, etc. They maybe just engage in small talk to assess where they at in their deen. And they may not tell you the legal issue, because their interest is not, the interest of the ulama is not theory alone, it's practice. Right? Because these are adwiya. Right? Right? You preserve their integrity, we also know how to apply it. But things like this, when you don't know how to apply it, someone asks a question like this, you take it to Ahl al-Ilm and you ask them. Not just what's the answer, but how would we apply it to a particular situation, to understand how they approach it. Radiyallahu ta'ala anhum. And we'll stop here. Any questions before we close?